Good afternoon, everybody. It's now officially noon on Monday, the 18th, and we are starting our next session. I'm so glad that you guys were all able to make it here today. I know we've gotten some really good feedback in the emails, although I know a few people had to miss. So as always, you can grab this on our website, on YouTube, or on Facebook whenever this is all finished, so that you can rewatch and come back whenever you need. But until then, we're going to start today's talk all about code coverage. It is one of the absolute hottest topics out there right now. People ask me all the time, "Hey Tony, the carrier is telling me that they don't have code upgrade coverage. This isn't code upgrade coverage, or they're saying I have code upgrade coverage, but they need proof that the city's actually trying to enforce it." Number of things that are coming up, and how it applies and when it doesn't apply, and all of these things. And we're going to hit on those all today. I don't know how long today's actually going to go. Normally, these things go about an hour. I feel like I'm going to be able to get through this a little bit quicker than usual, but I have a tendency to drag it on a little bit. So if you do have questions, we'll probably have even more time today than usual. So please use the chat feature. I'll be able to address those live. Let me know that you can hear me okay now and that this is all going well. But otherwise, ask questions that you might have throughout the process. It's one of the big benefits of this is that you can ask live questions, get live responses, and not have to wait for things like text messages and emails. And you can actually just talk to me personally. So today we are going to focus entirely on the code upgrade ordinance and law coverages. Now, this is an extremely hot topic and comes up in almost every policy in one way or another. Either the coverage is there or it isn't. But it's really important that you guys understand exactly how this language works within an insurance policy, because there's so many times that this can be triggered or come into effect, that you want to have a good understanding of the policy. With any claim under any policy, you always want to remember to read the policy. So while we are going to touch on some specific examples, please make sure that you review your actual policy in every single claim to see how that language works. Um, as we go through this, one of the things I always tell people is one of the most valuable things I can give you is my cell phone and email address. Emails take me a little bit to get back to, but text messages are generally pretty quick. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time, ask me a question. I'm happy to help. Also, by having this information, I'm giving you full authority to just follow up with me if you need. If you've got a question and I don't get back to you because I might be in a deposition or on a vacation or who knows doing what, you can follow up as often as you need. I will get back to you, I promise, but I don't mind the reminders, as they're often helpful to keep things at the top of my list. But feel free to reach out, call, email with any of your claims questions, or if a carrier is denying a claim or underpaying it and you need some help. The I've started doing these quotes, and this one felt all too perfect for particularly our entire industry. It's funny. All you have to do is say something nobody understands, and they'll do practically anything you want them to. That's from Catcher in the Rye. Uh, this is kind of the motto of insurance companies, right? Is they put a language into their policy that nobody's understands, and then they make claims that it means X, Y, and Z, and people just say, "Oh, okay." Luckily, as claims professionals in this industry, we know better, and we know that what they're saying isn't always going to be accurate. Sometimes it might be, but not always. One quick plug. I put this on the starting screen. We're really running low on space, but I want to fill it up. We've got more people that have signed up now that at this stage than last year, but we want to keep pushing those numbers. As many of you might be aware, I run, with the help of Holly Soffer, the PAGPS conference, the Public Adjuster Greater Philadelphia Summit, right in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, just minutes from the Philadelphia International Airport. It's really easy for everybody to get to, and the education is really top of the line. Last year, we got multiple comments how it was the most educational conference that anyone had ever been to, and we're really excited to do it again this year. We've got an amazing lineup. You can speak to the insurance department representatives themselves. We've got people, Doug Quinn, who's coming in to talk about insurance carrier fraud and how to help report that and to actually hold carriers accountable. We've got Sarah Parker coming in on AI and how to use that in public adjusting to save you time and make you money. I mean, there's a ton of great stuff. Matt Mulholland's coming in on hail and why everything you know about hail is wrong. It'll be a fantastic course. And then another debate this year with a insurance company defense attorney, which will be actually moderated and based off of questions from you guys. So really great stuff. Check out the website, and you absolutely should be coming if you can make it. I can nearly promise you it'll be the best money you've spent on education in this industry, because it's also not very expensive. It's right at phgps2023.com, or you can always check it out through the QR code that I'm about to give you. By the way, we are having an open bar and a karaoke night. So if you needed fun reasons to go, those are two really solid ones, to say the least. So you can scan your computer right now, take a look at the QR code, and sign up if you get a quick second. If you have any questions about it, you can ask me directly. I am happy to do it. Answer any questions about it. Again, I've kind of made this part of my yearly projects to get this conference put together. So to the extent that you can make it, I would truly love to see you there. All right. So that's enough time of this. Let's hop into what we're going to do this week. We're going to go through code upgrade and law and ordinance coverage, code compliance, and we're going to talk about the differences between those and the distinctions between repair methods versus code compliance versus code upgrades, what all of that really means in the sense of an insurance claim. And it does get confusing. And one of the reasons it gets so confusing is by this usage of that phrase code upgrade versus code compliance and ordinance and law. So we'll talk about those. I wanted to put a really important note here first, though. Not all states recognize the validity of an exclusion within the policy for code compliance. In other words, there are some states, and actually a good number of them across the country, that say the code compliance exclusion simply means you can't make a claim only because your house isn't up to code. By way of example, you've got a house, back in the 1950s, whatever, 60s, that has knob and tube wiring. And all of a sudden in the 80s, they come out with a code that says knob and tube wiring is no longer permitted in the use and construction of homes. You can't call your insurance company at that moment and say, hey, I've got an insurance claim because my home is no longer up to compliance. That is the basis of the original exclusion that was contained in the policies. It has morphed into this, crazy provision about, what kind of decking can you put back on the property? What can you do when it comes to tiling in your home or siding on the property? It has morphed into something much bigger as carriers tend to make it. But that was the original idea, and that's what a lot of states have supported. That you can't use this to say they're repairing their home, they've got to do it up to code, but we're not paying for that portion, even though it's part of the loss. So make sure if you are watching this and you've got these issues, you've spoken to an attorney about these provisions to see whether or not they are actually enforceable and how they are enforceable within your given state. All right. So now that I have that out of the way, the other distinction that we've talked about already briefly is this difference between code upgrade, which is often confused with the concepts of code ordinance and law and code compliance. Most policies, mass majority of them, talk about code compliance and ordinance and law compliance, not actually upgrading the property. The method of repair for an upgrade of some sort is a misnomer that has come out for some reason in a lot of policies and a lot of the ways people talk about it. And it's not that you're making the upgrade, it's that you're complying with current codes and the construction at that time. So make sure that we use the terms properly. Truth of the matter is, in our industry, all of these terms become almost interchangeable, but there are some distinctions that are important to note when you're going through the policy language itself. So be sure that you read your policy language and how that actual language applies to the loss, because again, there is a difference between upgrades and compliance. The situations that I want you to be thinking about, we're going to kind of review these at the beginning here, just conceptually, and then we're going to use what we learned to actually go over them. And I recognize this text is a little bit small, but I think these are all going to be situations that you're pretty familiar with. In one way or another, they've come up. You've got a situation number one, a hail loss on a roof with 2 different layers. As you know, in most states, there is a requirement that there can't be more than 2 layers on any given roof. And when they remove the roof, they find that the decking beat the hell from prior roof replacements, can't be safely nailed into again. Decking also happens to be a 1/2 inch when code is now requiring 5/8 inch for the decking. So the question is the decking covered? And what decking are they going to be paying for? Second situation that I want you guys thinking about as we're going through this. There's water damage to a bathroom. The bathroom's from 1934. The bathroom has asbestos tile, which has been regulated out of use. What does the carrier owe for in the rebuild? Things to think about. Do they owe the cost for asbestos removal versus just regular, ceramic tile removal? What about putting back asbestos? Do they owe to put asbestos tiles back in the house or some other similar product? The other example that kind of plays the same way is the knob and tube. We have a loss with knob and tube that's damaged by, let's say, a lightning strike. What does the carrier actually owe for it to put back? And last but not least, the home is damaged by a fire down the shore. The new code requires if a home is more than 50% damaged, it must be brought up to current codes, including raising of the home. This was actually really popular after some of the flooding in New Jersey from Sandy and came up a ton. So in these three scenarios, what's covered and what isn't, and the assumption to be that there's no added coverage for ordinance and law. They haven't purchased the add-on or the policy doesn't have any coverage for ordinance and law, just the standard exclusions. So I want you to be thinking about these as we go through so that we can talk at the end about them in those examples. So let's take a look at some policy language. Everybody who has heard me talk before generally knows who my favorite insurance company is, he said sarcastically. So let's start with them. State Farm. In most policies, the first time that you are going to see ordinance and law come up is going to be within the exclusions of the policy. Some of them have it under additional coverages, which will often be before the exclusions, but State Farm is with the majority here, and they've got exclusionary language for ordinance and law coverage. And it says, we will not pay for, under any part of this policy, any loss that would not have occurred in the absence of one or more of the following excluded events. This is their preamble to all of their exclusionary language, right? The concurrent causation language. In essence, saying we don't pay for a loss, whether it happened before, during, or after the claim, and if it's any part of the claim. Now, if you've heard my prior talks about the exclusions or ambiguous policy language, you should all know that this is ridiculously ambiguous because we know almost every exclusion in the policy has some form of an exception or ensuing loss provision, and this language doesn't actually mean what it says. And the ordinance and law coverage is no different than that because it is just as confusing and complicated. But either way, it's important to start and know that the ordinance and law falls under this exclusionary language. Then they go into the exclusion. We don't pay for ordinance and law, meaning the enforcement of any ordinance or law regulating the construction, repair, or demolition of a building structure or other structure. Now, first thing I want to point out, nowhere in here are they talking about upgrades to the property, right? Upgrading isn't the issue here. It is simply compliance with an ordinance or a law. But there's one really important word in this entire sentence, and I want you to read this over and try and think of what do you believe is the most important word in this entire sentence. I'll give you a second to read through it so you have a moment without me just talking in your ear. All right, that should be more than enough, I hope. But as you're thinking about it, let's not bury the lead for too much longer. The word is enforcement. The reason this is the most important word in the entire section is they're talking about enforcement that they don't pay for, right? When something is being done as the result of the enforcement of a code, that would fall under ordinance and law coverage. And we're going to talk in detail through some of these examples in later language why that is so important. But I'll tell you right now, if the work isn't being done because of the enforcement of an ordinance or law, it doesn't fall under this exclusion. Let me repeat that because it bears repeating. If the work isn't being done purely because of the enforcement of an ordinance or law, it does not fall under the ordinance and law exclusion. Hopefully that makes sense, but we're going to go through tons of examples to make sure that it makes sense to you in the end. But let's finish up with the language of this State Farm policy. Now, this is scattered. All of this language is scattered throughout the policy. There's no one great endorsement or one section of the policy that always talks about it. We start with the exclusionary language, and now we're jumping to the loss payment language. And it says, we will not pay for increased costs resulting from enforcement, there's that word again, of any ordinance or law regulating the construction, repair, or demolition of a building structure or other structure, except, now we get an exception, except as provided under optional policy provisions, option OL, building ordinance and law. Now, this language is nearly identical to what we saw in the exclusion, except the exclusion, which says we don't pay any portion of a claim if it involves ordinance and law. Well, now we've got it saying it doesn't pay for it unless it falls within the endorsement or the optional coverage. So we know that that other provision isn't absolute because there's this optional coverage also available under the policy. Well, now we have to jump into the optional coverage after we realize that this is has that same increased cost resulting from enforcement language. And we go to, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about this portion. There is a flip side to this. So we've talked so strongly about the enforcement, right? The increased cost resulting from enforcement. When you do have code upgrade coverage and you do have a code upgrade loss, the carriers will often come back and say, well, wait a second, there's no evidence that the department or your city is actually going to be enforcing this code. So as a result, we're not paying for it. That is utter, pardon my French, bullshit, because it is absolutely untrue as to their requirements as a matter of law. I use an example all the time when people ask me about this. They say, well, wait, they want me to reach out to the city. They want them to prove that they're enforcing this language, that we're actually going to have these costs. Total nonsense. And use this example of driving down the street. Do you only have to go the speed limit when a police officer is behind you? Of course not, right? That would be an absolutely ludicrous assumption. And these codes and laws and ordinance and all those issues are no different. They are absolute. They must be complied with. So it doesn't matter if some city official could be bribed into having you not do it. It doesn't matter if that city official is lazy and just doesn't enforce this stuff. None of it matters. If it's in the law, it is required, period, end of story. So make sure you put them on the spot and say, look, this is the law. No city official can tell me otherwise. There's no right for them to waive this provision. Unless you can show me that, carrier, you're going to owe me for these for this law and ordinance coverage. So now we jump back into the language. We go to the optional coverage, right? The optional coverage under the State Farm policy reads pretty clearly. We cover the damaged portions of building structure when a building structure covered under coverage A is damaged by a loss insured. We will pay for the increased cost to repair or rebuild the physically damaged portion of the building structure caused by the enforcement of a building, zoning, or land use ordinance or law if the enforcement is directly caused by the same loss insured. And the requirement looks like that cut off and is probably on the next page. No, it looks like it just got cut off. Long story short is they're adding in now ordinance and law coverage, right? So if the loss is now requiring some ordinance and law to be triggered for work to be done, then that is going to be covered as well. But it gets more complicated because it doesn't just end there. It doesn't just say, okay, but now it's going to be covered. It's going to keep going and say, well, now we're going to talk about undamaged portions of the damaged building structure. And when a building structure covered under coverage A is damaged by a loss, we will pay for the cost to demolish and clear the site of the undamaged portion of the building structure caused by the enforcement of a building, zoning, or land use ordinance or law if the enforcement is directly caused by the same insured and the requirement is in effect at the time the loss insured occurs. Okay, what the hell does all of this mean? Let's use our example where a house down the shore was burned over 50%. Now that entire building will need to be demolished or raised and rebuilt at a higher level given current building codes. This would provide coverage for that cost of raising the property, right? There's no other reason I am raising this property other than the fact that I must comply with the ordinance and laws of that local city. So that would be a perfect example of when this would trigger so that you've got coverage for that raising of the house. Even though you're demoing undamaged portions, you're doing work that wasn't there previously, all of that would fall under this for the ordinance and law coverage. It does go even further. loss to the undamaged portion of the building structure caused by enforcement. The enforcement is directly caused by the same loss insured. The enforcement requires the demolition of portions of the same building not damaged by the loss insured. The ordinance and law regulates the construction or repair of the building structure or establishes zoning or land use requirements. The ordinance and law is in force at the time of the occurrence of the same. So these are all your requirements to trigger. Again, all of them being met at the time of the loss. They keep going further. And really, you've got to read these for every policy. I don't want to be the boring person who's just reading policy language to you, but it is important for you to understand that reading through this is critical to your analysis when you're adjusting these claims. But what I really wanted to point out in this last section, this is more about undamaged, but they add this language at the end that really doesn't make any sense to me. And it has the same ambiguities as the concurrent causation language. It says, we will not pay for legally required changes to specific building structure features, systems, or components that have not been physically damaged by the loss insured. That doesn't mean anything, right? It certainly doesn't mean anything that could make easy sense of that language. If you've got an answer to it, I'd love to hear it. But they just went through 4 paragraphs explaining how undamaged portions of a property are covered in the event that there is ordinance and law coverage in a triggering event. And now they're trying to say that it's not covered if it's undamaged. It is total nonsense. I don't understand who writes this language because, look, I'm an attorney who deals with policy language all the time. I couldn't make this language up if I tried. It is total nonsense. So make sure that you have a good understanding back and forth of the language. And if you have these questions as they arise in a claim, please speak with an attorney. If you don't want to speak with me for some reason, speak to somebody who knows this industry, because a carrier could very easily, and I know they do this, I know it for a fact because I've got claims like it, they will send a denial letter to an insured that quotes this last section, right? And they'll say, hey, we were right here in the policy that we are not obligated to pay for changes to the structure if there's no damage to that structure under the law and ordinance. And that's just not true. It's the exact same way they try and quote the concurrent causation language in the exclusions, but they always or often will leave out the ensuing loss language. It's not how the policy is interpreted. It's not how it's written. And you really need to get an understanding as you are fighting these claims. So John just threw in a question. Going back to wiring a home, if I have a partial fire in the second floor, do they owe for opening all the walls to replace and upgrade the wiring? Well, as every attorney does, we start almost all of our answers off with, it depends. And we're going to go through some of this in a little bit, John, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. If you've had the wiring tested, you did a mega ohm test on the wiring and all of it needs to be replaced by the fire, that's an easy one. Of course, it needs to be done. If all of it is being done as a result of the code issue only, then you've got to have the code upgrade coverage. However, if there is another reason the wiring needs to be replaced, for example, there's no proper way to tie into the old lines with new wiring, or there's risk of fire in the combination of old wiring with new wiring, or who knows what other reason. If there's any other reason beyond code upgrade, you've got a very good chance to get that covered under the loss without having any type of ordinance and law or code upgrade coverage within the policy. But we can go through some of those questions in more detail as we progress through this. So the last portion of the State Farm policy I wanted you guys to take a look at least to my recollection, the last portion of the policy is the loss settlement provisions within the policy. This is the how we pay for a loss. And this is really important because this gets into, well, when it's not a code enforcement, when this isn't purely code enforcement, what do carriers owe for? And this is relatively similar to most policies that you're going to see. And it's going to say that we will pay the cost to repair or replace with similar construction and for the same use on the premises shown in the declarations, the damaged part of the property covered under Section A dwelling, blah, blah, blah. And then it talks about ACV. But I want to talk about that portion because that is kind of the moneymaker here for the arguments. Carriers make these concepts of damaged versus undamaged portions of the property all the time, right? That they only owe for the damaged portion of the claim. The truth is, they owe for whatever it takes to repair the damaged portion of the claim. And that's the part that carriers miss all the time. They want to make a claim that they only owe for the damaged portion, but that's not true. They owe whatever it takes, the cost to repair the damaged portion. So the next obvious question always has to be, well, what does it take? What is the scope of my work to repair the damaged portion? That is where the difference is made between code compliance, ordinance, and law, and just regular coverage under the policy. Because you need to be asking yourself, am I doing this purely because of a ordinance and law, or am I doing it because it's what's necessary to repair or replace the damaged part of the property? We've got a roof example, right? And we're going to talk about this again in a little more detail later when we go over them specifically. But if you have a roof that is damaged, that's got multiple layers, and you have to tear it off, you can't put a new roof on top of it. You have to tear it off, and you get down to decking that is damaged underneath of it for whatever reason. It could be the oldest rot in the world. It could be that it was hammered through 50 times and there's no good nail, no more grab on it. It could be that there are, cedar shake underneath that are deteriorated and no longer a suitable surface. Any of those situations require that the decking be replaced on that property to repair the roof that was damaged from this loss, from the hail or the wind. And as soon as you've got that, as soon as that's necessary to repair the roof, just like it says here, the cost to repair or replace those damaged shingles. Well, this is necessary, a necessary cost to repair the shingles. There's no other way to do it. That is how you can get this coverage and this payment without ever having to worry about ordinance and law, because it falls under this exact provision within the policy. I hope that makes sense, because it can be a real game changer in these claims. I'm going to repeat a lot of this stuff a few times to make sure that it's clear, but if it's not, at some point to you guys, please chime in with questions. So, the other aspect of this that I threw in, that when repair or replacement is actually completed, we'll pay the paid when incurred costs. A lot of policies, and I note this in one later slide as well, a lot of policies have this as a paid when incurred cost under the policies. So here are the questions. In every claim that you're being worked on and you're being questioned about ordinance and law or code compliance, you should ask these questions. Number one, regardless of any codes, what will be necessary to repair the covered damage? Leave code out of this, right? Just go in there and ask yourself, what do I need done, to fix the roof? Or John, in your situation, what do I need done to properly repair the wiring on the second floor? And if the answer is, I need to go beyond that, I'm going to be touching unaffected areas of this home, undamaged portions of the home, but it's necessary to repair the damaged portion, you've got coverage for that. The next question, am I doing that repair because of a law or ordinance, or am I doing the repair because of some other reason? So you've kind of gone through your scope, you figured out what you need to do, you've tried to leave code and ordinance out of it, but you got to ask yourself again, is it the only reason I'm doing this? Is the only reason, for example, when I'm raising the house, am I only doing that because of ordinance and law coverage? Last but not least, is the work only necessary because of that law and ordinance? These are all kind of duplicative. I know you're thinking to yourself, wait a second, isn't this the same question that's three different ways? Yes, it actually is. It's what attorneys do all the time to make sure that people are truly understanding the breadth of their questions, and the information is always consistent across all three. If you get consistent answers across all three of these questions, you've got a really good shot at having coverage for this claim, regardless of the ordinance and law. So when you have these losses, you'll ask these questions. So let's talk about the situations one last time for these before we look at a few other examples from some other policies. So we've got the hail loss to a roof with 2 layers. The removal of the decking, it's beat to hell. And now we also need to upgrade that decking that was a 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch as a result of the code. So we have 1/2 inch decking, needs to be upgraded as a result of code to 5/8 inch decking. Does this fall under ordinance and law coverage, or is it covered regardless of ordinance and law coverage? Give you a second to think about that one, although we've talked about it quite at length. And if you want to chime in the chat just for fun, you feel free. Obviously, you can, but that is up to you. Plenty of time. The answer and the correct one is it's owed regardless of the ordinance and law. Just because they have to change from a half inch to 5/8 inch doesn't mean anything for this claim because that decking needed to be replaced no matter what. Now, there is a potential gray area, and the gray area would be, well, does the carrier owe for 1/2 inch decking or does it owe for 5/8 inch decking? There's no question if you have law and ordinance coverage, you can easily get the 5/8 inch decking. If you don't, however, the next question you need to ask is can you find anybody to do this job using 1/2 inch decking? And if the job is impossible to be done, and when I say impossible, meaning you can't find anyone to do it, not that it physically couldn't be done, but you can't find a contractor who will actually do it with 1/2 inch decking, then you've got another argument now towards getting it paid without the ordinance and law coverage. Because again, the carrier owes you whatever it will cost to repair the damaged property. And if the only way to get the roof covered, the roof replaced, is because every contractor uses 5/8, then you've got a great reasoning here for not using the ordinance and law coverage. Now, the next one, water damage to the bathroom from 1934. This is asbestos, right? You've got asbestos that's in the property. Clearly, the bathroom has been damaged by Category 3 water. No one's disputing the place needs, or the room needs to be torn out and put back. So, what does the carrier owe you? Well, another great example of impossibility of performance. In a perfect world, the carrier might try to argue, well, you had asbestos, we owe you for asbestos. Well, nobody actually does that. No carrier is going in there and saying, oh, you had asbestos before, so that's all we're paying you for. They find the similar construction as to what is now. So if they want to go back with ceramic, so be it. That's what they owe for. They also owe to repair that damaged tile, regardless of code, the cost to tear it out and have asbestos removal, not just, Joe Schmo demo tearing the place apart. And the fact of the matter is, it's because they owe, that's what it costs to repair this property. It has nothing to do with codes. That you're tearing this out and this is the safety precautions necessary, regardless of any law or ordinance. So they owe for that. And they clearly don't owe the asbestos. What's nice about this example is it plays so well into the first one as well. And what do I mean by that? In this scenario, you can't go back with asbestos. It's impossible, right? No tile guy is going back in there with asbestos tile. It's exactly, and that's common sense. There's no carrier that will argue with you on that one. So use that example in the decking for the roof and say, well, wait a second. You agreed you wouldn't pay for asbestos because no contractor would ever do that. It's not possible. There's no different with my 1/2 inch decking on the roof. So why are you not paying for the 5/8? Because that's the only thing anyone will do, meaning that's the proper repair. Plays exactly the same here. And it goes the same for knob and tube wiring under the same theory. Nobody is putting knob and tube back into that property. It's not used anymore. Regardless of codes, you physically could not find somebody to do it. So they're not going to have to owe for it. Again, a common example that carriers aren't going to be fighting you on. Last one, the home is damaged by fire down the shore. The code requires the home, if it's damaged by more than 50%, to be raised. And now they've got to raise the property. Is the raising of that property covered if there's no code coverage under the policy? Is this one as clear and obvious to you? I'm wondering because I truly don't know. But the answer here is if you don't have code coverage, you're not getting this paid for. And the reason being is you are only raising that house as a result of the code. There is no other reason that is being done, literally other than the code. So you need to have that code compliance for that coverage. So make sure that you understand these as you're going through. I added in a few extra examples so that we could go over ones that you weren't already thinking about. But here are ones that can also lead to some gray area, at least with carriers, not so much with me. But you've got a house that's damaged on two sides by wind. I don't think I put it on here. It's siding, vinyl siding, let's call it. Two of the sides are undamaged. Code requires that any siding put on a home needs to be put over, quote, a water-resistant barrier free from holes. It's kind of the key language, free from holes. And that any of the seams in that barrier must overlap 6 inches. Does the carrier owe to wrap the house? Uh, and this is again assuming that there is no code coverage. There's a distinction between the proper method of repair and code upgrades here that I want you to be thinking about. So, if there is no code compliance coverage on this policy, what do you think? Does the carrier owe to wrap the house if the code requires that the siding be put on top of a water-resistant barrier free from holes? If anyone wants to chime in, now is your time before I just keep talking and letting an answer go here. It'd be nice if I could actually see what people were typing, because then I could have a sense of, should I just keep rambling until the comment comes through? No, then we get one though. Otherwise, you don't even have, so curious who you are because all it says is otherwise on there. So we got a mystery person contributing to the chat. So short answer is yes, they still owe to wrap the house. And this, again, doesn't go just to the code. It's easy under code compliance. If you've got code compliance and you've got a house with siding on it, you should be able to get that house wrapped because of the code language without a question. But the other issue here comes to proper methods of repair. If both there is a code and a construction standard of this is how we properly make the repair, you can lean on that method of repair just as heavily as you could the code to get it covered. This would fall under the same concept as the roof decking or the asbestos. If you can't find a contractor who would be willing to make the repair, which is great evidence to a carrier of impossibility of repair, then you can make that argument for the house wrap as well. Again, very easy with the code language because you have to put it over a water-resistant barrier, but it's another way around that in the event that it's necessary for a claim. All right, one more with the roof. We have a roof now with 3 layers, right? You're not supposed to have more than 2, but this one decided to have 3. And a handful of shingles are damaged from wind, and they could likely be physically replaced, right? Someone could go up on a 3-layer roof, take these ones out, put them back in with new ones, but the client can't find a roofer who's willing to do it. What does the carrier owe for in that situation? Again, I want you to think about this a little bit as I continue to ramble, but really the key here is you've already got a roof that is non-compliant, right? It's got 3 layers and it's not supposed to, and the carrier wants to do a patch on top of that roof, but they're not having anyone find it. And the answer, without me having to continue rambling on any further, is they would owe for the roof replacement at that point. Again, unless it can actually be repaired and they can show somebody and have a contractor physically do the work, just saying it isn't good enough. It's not enough for a carrier who isn't the one physically doing a repair to say, oh, it could be done this way, so that's all we're going to pay for. I've actually had a carrier get even worse than this. This is actually a scenario that we have in one of my claims, 3-layer roof. Carrier accepted that there's hail damage to the roof. No question about it. They have their own expert report that indicates there's hail. However, they said that the roof can't be patched because it's 3 layers. So as a result, and you really won't believe this when I say it, as a result, they're not paying anything for the damaged roof since the only option is to tear it off and replace it. It's too extensive of a repair, and they're not going to pay for the damage. Totally ludicrous. Great bad faith case, in my opinion, and really shocked me when I read that. That was one that really did surprise me, and it falls under this situation. All right, so I wanted you to take a look at a few other carriers just quickly so that you had a sense of what other carrier language uses. And I'll go through Allstate first, and I've got Travelers in here as well. But Allstate here says, we do not cover actions taken by civil, governmental, or military authorities to enforce any building codes, ordinances, or law regulating or requiring the construction, reconstruction, maintenance, replacement, repair, placement, or demolition of any building structure, other structures, or land or residence. This is their catch-all exclusion for ordinance and law coverage and uses somewhat similar language to State Farm. Allstate does, however, this is actually continuing further on. Payment under A, B, or C above will not include any increased cost due to the enforcement of building codes, ordinance, blah, blah, blah. This is after their coverage section, so they say it twice in their policy before providing their additional coverage, which is we will pay to the limit of liability for building code coverages to comply with local building codes after covered loss to the dwelling and when repair or replacement results in increased costs due to that enforcement of any building codes, yada, yada, yada. So, in the exact same way State Farm did, Allstate very similarly excludes it, puts another exclusion at the end of their at the end of the coverages provision, and then adds in additional coverage. The traveler's policy actually has ordinance and law coverage part of their standard additional coverages. So if you go into the additional coverage portion of the traveler's policy, they will have similar language under most of their forms that I've seen. But as always, check your policies specifically. And on this one, so we've got you may use up to the greater of 10% or higher percentage, if any shown on the declarations, for ordinance or law of the limit of liability and for the increased cost you incur due to the enforcement of any ordinance or law which requires or regulates the construction, demo, blah, blah, blah. So now we've got it actually part of the base policy and within the traveler's form so that you can look at it there. Long story short, you want to be looking through these policies to find out where the ordinance and law exclusions are and where any add backs for those might be. This is their undamaged language within travelers. I won't spend too much time on it. It's relatively similar in concept. If you have specific questions on it, please feel free to let me know. And if you're ever rewatching this in the future, you can pause it if you need more time to look it over. Some other things to note. As I mentioned, some policies have ordinance and law coverages as PWI, paid when incurred. So you want to make sure you know that from jump so that you can properly set your expectations for your insureds and let them know what to expect and when to expect it. The other thing you want to note is if you have code coverage and there's no limits issue, it often isn't worth the fight, and you can put it wherever you need. But be careful where the carrier is putting and where you're agreeing or not agreeing to it for future claims. So let's just say for hypothetical purposes, you've got that State Farm claim and you've got a situation where they have O&L coverage. And as a result, you make the argument that the decking requirement falls under O&L and they pay it, no problems. Well, next you get a claim in 2 weeks later that has the same issue, only they don't have the O&L coverage. And you come back and say, oh, well, that's actually part of the proper method of repair, not ordinance and law. So you've got to cover it under that. You're right. And you're going to be right both times. All I'm saying is it could make your arguments a little more difficult if they come back and say, well, wait, here you said it was ordinance and law coverage versus the proper method of repair. The truth is it can be both. And that's why you could, arguably be safe in doing it. But all I'm trying to do is avoid hiccups for you later down the road. So a question from Otherwise. I'm really curious who you are, Otherwise. If you're willing to disclose, let me know, although the mystery is potentially more exciting than whatever the answer might be. But sorry if I missed this, but what do you recommend for an endorsement for code upgrade? You're not going to have too much choice in most policies as to what the endorsement will be. But what you're generally looking for is that blanket coverage without limits, or without low limits. Some carriers have $5,000 for code upgrades, and that's relatively useless. But you're looking for that the language, even similar to State Farm, where you've got language covering the damaged portion, undamaged portions, really a broad spectrum of availability for ordinance and law when you're looking at the endorsements. But they're all going to vary carrier to carrier. And, it's really going to be just a matter of getting it or not getting it, not so much what the specific language is. All right. So what do you do when there's a dispute, right? So all of this, I try and leave all of my talks with some type of action items so that you can do things in the field to actually make this clearer and you don't have to come to me. I tell it in every speech I give. I don't want you to have to use me. In a perfect world, you can get claims paid and I never have to come in. And I can say that safely because I know carriers are always going to be denying unreasonably in their claims, and I'll have work. But the better thing for the insureds is to get you paid and get them paid without having to use me. So here are the action items this time around. If you've got a claim, get an engineer or a construction expert to explain the scope of the loss. And if you have them come in and say, look, this has nothing to do with code. This is the proper method of repair for whatever the issue is. And the repair would actually be impossible to do otherwise, regardless of the code. you've got a great piece of evidence there to provide to them. I tell everyone, and I'm going to remind you again, the easiest time to overturn a denial is before it happens. So provide these documents ahead of time. Don't don't be on the defensive after denial trying to get this stuff. It's so much harder to overturn a denial. If you show up to the first inspection with all of your ammunition of here's my contractor's report, here are my estimates, here's my photos, here's my Xactimate, so you can use my scopes and make your life easier. Whatever you can do to make their life easier and a faster decision, you'll get better results. Number two, proof of impossibility of repairs. Get multiple contractors to just write a letter, write an email, 2 sentences to the client saying, we reviewed the scope from State Farm and we can't do it that way. It's impossible to make the repair that way. Get it from 3 or 4 contractors. That's great evidence that they can't do it the way that they are claiming they want you to do it. Number 3, if your state requires it, like New Jersey, make the carrier get you a contractor that can do it the way they're saying they can do it, and then put them on the spot. And here's the real trick. It's not enough just to tell them, hey, get me a contractor, because they're going to give you some ServPro or some other someone else who is on their preferred vendor list. And nothing against ServPro, by the way, that some of the ServPros are great companies. But whoever the preferred vendor is, and they might come out and say, sure, I can do it. But you've got to take it one step further and say, okay, if you say you can do it, send me your contract, send me your insurance and proof that you'll add me on as an insured under your policy, and confirm that there will be no amendments necessary in writing. There will be no amendments necessary to these repairs based off of what you know now. And if I think I've done this, I don't know, 3 dozen, 4 dozen times. Never once, not once, has the carrier's contractor come through with that information and actually been willing to do the job. So if you use that information against them, it puts them in an impossible position, the carrier in an impossible position, and they must pay more on the claim. Last but not least, the get written confirmation from a city when it is available and you're trying to show that there's a code requirement. Contact your city. And it's really important, by the way, to do it the right way, because I've had a defense attorney try to do this to me, and they contacted the city and asked the most absurd leading question, which was, when a person has a one piece of damaged siding, do they need to replace all of the siding on their home? And that was the way the defense attorney asked the question. And it was an absurd question to be asked to the code enforcement official. So he wrote back and says, no, I don't believe that that's necessary. And I followed up. I said, Mr. Code enforcement official, I want to make sure that this is clear. It's not that they just had a piece of damaged siding, they're leaving it on their home and they don't have to replace all of it. They're choosing to make a repair of that damaged siding, and the code indicates that it must be put over a water-resistant barrier. Can they ignore the code and put the new siding up over a water-resistant barrier that has holes all through it? And he came back, of course they can't do that. They need to comply with all the codes that are in effect. And change the complete case, they paid the full value on that one. So make sure that you are taking the lead and recognizing the right questions to be asked in those situations. All right, there was just a handful of questions that came through from the hundreds or so registrants for this. So I want to go through those, because I've always promised, even if they have nothing to do with the talk, I will hit whatever question it is so that everyone makes sure they understand that I'm happy to help in any way I can. But this was the first one. What is the definition of minimum building standards, and where does this apply in the policy? So this really comes down to what the policy language says. Most of the time, there is no definition. I've actually never seen a definition for minimum building standards. It's no different than saying kind of the industry standards of insurance adjusting, right? They're not necessarily written down anywhere. They're more of an understood and known, but there is no particular definition. The only time they will apply in a policy is if the policy indicates that they apply, and that's extremely rare. So what you're going to be looking for most of the time isn't minimum building standards, but rather just what is actually possible and feasible for contractors in the field to be handling these claims. So if you get 3 contractors that come back and say, I can't make these repairs, that is in essence a minimum building standard for whatever this repair is, and you can make it apply that way. But on the official side of things, it can be more difficult to argue minimum standards because it's not terminology that comes up in a lot of policies. We've got a question from Tom Cipriano. Tom says, Dealing with Assurant. I've forced I'm assuming them to name a contractor willing to detach and reinstall granite countertops. They named Paul Davis. However, Paul Davis also says they will not get involved in a claim that is PA representative. Where do I go now? Go back to the carrier and say, carrier, we reached out to Paul Davis. They've refused to cooperate. You need to give me somebody else. And keep going into that well as often as you need because they will run out. And granite countertop removal is a perfect example, right? Because 98% of the time it's going to break and the carrier doesn't want to pay for it until it does. So public adjusters rightfully put that into the estimate and carriers push back. Well, carrier, prove to me it can be done. Send somebody out to do it and we're fine. I don't care. Keep your countertop. But the truth is they can't actually do it. So Tom, you should absolutely go back to the carrier, tell them that Paul Davis is refusing to comply and to get you somebody else. And you're going to have the same, I would guess, the same issue again when that happens. All right. So next question. Whose expert opinion is needed to present to trigger code coverage? Electrical in particular, water loss where wiring gets wet, what level fire loss will necessitate partial versus full rewiring? Everyone knows knob and tube gets coverage. What about others like aluminum clad or the 1950s style BX wiring? So just like I mentioned before, engineers and contractors are a great way to go. With wiring in particular, getting an electrician out there, indicating the system is unsafe or it can't be repaired are fantastic ways to go about getting that wiring redone. Again, your focus is on, as a result of this loss, I cannot repair this damage, the covered damage, everything everyone's agreeing to. I can't repair that without doing this, right? Without doing X, replacing the rest of the wiring. Have them explain why, and that should get you a long way, if not the whole way, to getting the coverage without having to worry about ordinance and law. I think this might, oh no, two more questions. State Farm previously agreed to pay for code upgrades when the client submits a written agreement with a roofer. Now State Farm says they will only pay when client submits a paid repair invoice. They also say they do not want to pay for the step flashing. Not quite a question, but I at least understood what they're getting at. State Farm changed their method, right? What do they have to do before? What did have to be done to get an incurred cost versus before versus now? Truth of the matter is you've got to look to the policy first to determine if it truly is a paid when incurred expense. Some policies have it as paid when incurred, some don't. See if it says that and start there. If it is a paid when incurred expense, a contract with a contractor is enough to trigger an incurred expense. Incurred doesn't mean my cash went to X person. It means I owe X person regardless of anything else down the line. Right, that I already owe that money. As soon as I sign the contract, I'm going to be liable for that amount. So that's an incurred expense, and you should be making that argument accordingly. Here's the rub, and here's where things get tricky with people, and I understand it. There are times when I've heard of public adjusters trying to get a contractor's contract turned in, and then the work will never get done. So they're trying to get paid for something that's incurred that doesn't get done, and that's what carriers are nervous about. And arguably rightfully so. So short answer is, so long as you're having the client actually do the work, have them do the work, right? Show the invoice in the end once the work is completed and done, and get the money released. And that's the easiest way. If you've got a contractor that you work with regularly, hopefully they're okay with waiting on that final check just until the payment comes through from the carrier. If your client is in such a hard spot that they just can't afford those repairs, you've got to work closely with your adjuster from the carrier to try and get other arrangements in place. And a lot of them will work with you. It's one of the many reasons I have told adjusters situations like that, where you get more bees with honey than you do vinegar. If you've got the good relationships, I've personally done this with a number of adjusters and defense attorneys from carriers who will work with us on paid when incurred expenses in the event that there are hardships associated with it, and you should hopefully be able to go that route. In a theft claim, is the PA required to do an EUO along with the insured? This had obviously nothing to do with code upgrades, but wanted to address it anyway. And the short answer is usually no, depending on the state. There are some states like Florida that I understand require the public adjusters to sit for EUOs, but most policies just say that the insureds have to do their best to have third parties comply, but it can't be forced. Excuse me, and it can't be a basis for the denial. So read the policy and make sure. One last plug for PAGPS. If you have watched this and you liked the content, you're going to get a ton more doing this live with a ton of talks from both myself and many experts in the industry from all across the country. And you should absolutely sign up. It will be worth every penny that you spend. I absolutely promise. Really, the costs just cover your food and drinks for the weekend. The CEs end up being nearly free. Given the cost of everything else that we're doing. So we're really just paying for food and drink, so you can't beat it. I'd love to see you all there. As always, here's my contact information. You can reach out anytime you want. I'm always happy to help. I thank you guys so much. And if there are no more questions, I wish you all a wonderful week, and we will talk soon. And I hope to see you on the next one. All right. Thanks so much.